You didn't meet them by accident. I know that sounds dramatic, maybe even a little dangerous to believe, but stay with me for a minute. Because there are people who enter your life and leave almost no psychological footprint at all. You forget their voice, their face blurs, their messages stop mattering within days. And then there's this person, the one your mind keeps returning to at 2 a.m. for reasons you still can't fully explain. The one who made you feel strangely awake again and uncomfortable at the exact same time. That combination matters more than you think. And if you've ever sat alone wondering, why did meeting them affect me this deeply? Then this conversation is probably going to hit somewhere you weren't expecting. And before we go further, if you're the kind of man who quietly carries thoughts like this without really talking about them, subscribe. Not because I need the number, but because some conversations are easier to face when you stop pretending you're the only one having them. Now, most men think attraction begins with appearance. It doesn't. Appearance gets your attention. Recognition gets your soul involved. That's why sometimes you meet someone objectively beautiful and feel nothing real. And other times, someone walks into your life and within days they've disrupted your routines, your focus, even your sense of emotional control. Not because they're perfect, but because they touched a part of you that had been emotionally asleep. See, men rarely realize how lonely they've become emotionally until someone suddenly makes them feel seen. Not admired, not validated, seen. There's a difference. Admiration feeds the ego. Being seen reaches something much deeper. The part of you you've spent years managing, hiding, distracting, numbing. And the strange thing is, the people who affect us most deeply usually arrive during periods where we've quietly disconnected from ourselves. After disappointment, after emotional exhaustion, after becoming too logical for too long. A lot of men watching this have built entire personalities around staying composed, functional, reliable, unbothered. But internally, they're starving for emotional honesty, not weakness, honesty. And then someone appears who somehow bypasses all the defenses you carefully built over the years. Suddenly you care what they think. Suddenly silence from them changes your mood. Suddenly you're analyzing conversations in the shower like your brain is trying to solve a crime scene. You tell yourself, I'm overthinking. But deep down, it doesn't feel like overthinking. It feels like your nervous system recognized something before your mind could explain it. That's why these connections feel unsettling, because they expose contradictions. You say you want peace, but they make you feel alive. You say you hate emotional games, but uncertainty with them becomes addictive. You say you're independent, but one shift in their energy suddenly affects your entire day. And that scares men more than they admit. Not because they're weak, because losing emotional control feels dangerous when you've spent years surviving through self-control. A man can handle stress, pressure, isolation, but emotional uncertainty, that's the thing that humbles him, especially when the connection touches old wounds he thought he buried. That's the part nobody talks about honestly. Sometimes you didn't meet this person to complete your life. Sometimes you met them because they revealed what was missing from it, and those are two very different things. Because not every intense connection is meant to last forever. Some people arrive to expose patterns, to reveal emotional hunger, to force you to confront the version of yourself you became while trying not to get hurt again. And I think part of you already knows this. That's why this connection feels heavier than attraction. It feels symbolic, like your life quietly split into before meeting them and after. And the frightening part? You still don't fully understand why. What makes this harder is that the connection usually doesn't begin in some dramatic, movie-like way. It's smaller than that, quieter. A conversation that lingered in your head longer than it should have. A look they gave you that felt strangely personal. The feeling that around them, you became more aware of yourself. That's the detail men often miss. Certain people don't just make you notice them, they make you notice you. Your habits, your fears, your emotional reflexes, the parts of yourself you thought were under control. And at first, it feels exciting, almost relieving, because when you've spent years emotionally disconnected, even a small spark can feel life-changing. Especially for men who've learned to survive through routine. Wake up, work, Distract yourself. Repeat. You become efficient at functioning while quietly feeling nothing. And then someone enters your life and suddenly music sounds different again. Your thoughts get louder. You care about how you look before seeing them. You reread texts. You start imagining futures you never used to imagine anymore. Not because you're irrational, because hope is returning. That's why these connections feel dangerous. Hope changes people. A man who expects nothing protects himself naturally. But the moment he begins emotionally investing in possibility, he becomes vulnerable in ways he forgot existed. And vulnerability is strange for men. Most men were never taught how to experience it safely. They were taught how to suppress it, manage it, hide it behind humor, distance, productivity, sarcasm, even confidence. Especially confidence. Some of the most emotionally guarded men look extremely calm on the outside, but internally, they're monitoring every shift in energy from the person they care about. Did her tone change? Why did she take longer to reply? Did I say too much? What if I imagined this whole connection? And the painful part is, he usually feels embarrassed for caring that much. So instead of expressing it honestly, he retreats into silence and analysis. That's where overthinking is born. Not from weakness, from emotional ambiguity mixed with fear. Because uncertainty activates old emotional memories men don't even realize they carry. The fear of not being enough, the fear of being replaced, the fear of opening up and feeling foolish afterward. And sometimes, this person didn't create those fears. They simply exposed them. That realization changes everything, because when someone affects you deeply, it's tempting to believe they are the source of all the intensity. But often, they're interacting with emotional terrain that already existed inside you. Old loneliness, old rejection, old emotional deprivation, old versions of yourself that never fully healed. That's why the connection feels bigger than the actual amount of time you've known them. Your mind says, this is moving too fast, but emotionally it feels ancient, familiar, almost like your nervous system has met this feeling before. And here's something uncomfortable most men eventually realize. Sometimes you become attached not only to who the person is, but to who you become around them. That version of yourself who feels hopeful again, open again, motivated again, alive again. And when the connection becomes unstable, you don't just fear losing them, you fear losing access to that version of yourself. That's why heartbreak can feel existential. It's not always about the other person leaving. Sometimes it's grief over the emotional awakening disappearing with them. And the cruel irony is, men often don't recognize how deeply attached they are until distance enters the picture, until the energy changes, until the good morning texts disappear, until they notice themselves checking their phone with this quiet ache they can't really explain. That ache is important, because it reveals something most men spend years trying to outrun. Human beings can survive without emotional connection, but they do not come alive without it. You know what's fascinating? The people who change us emotionally are rarely the people we expected to fall for. It's usually not the perfect person on paper, not the safest choice, not even the most compatible one sometimes. It's the person who somehow reaches the emotional territory nobody else could access. And that's exactly why these connections can become so psychologically consuming. Because they interrupt identity. A lot of men think they know themselves, until someone enters their life and exposes emotional reactions they didn't know they were capable of. Jealousy, longing, tenderness, fear, need. Not superficial need, real need. The kind that makes a man stare at his ceiling at night, replaying tiny interactions like they carried hidden meaning. And maybe part of what disturbs you is this. You've probably spent years becoming emotionally self-sufficient. You learned not to rely on people too much, not to expect too much, not to chase, not to reveal too much too early. You became careful, controlled. But this person made control feel almost impossible sometimes, and men hate admitting that. Because emotional composure becomes part of masculine identity for a lot of people. If you remain calm, detached, unaffected, you feel powerful. But intense connection dismantles that illusion quietly. Suddenly, your emotional state is reacting to another human being again. That loss of internal predictability feels terrifying when you're used to managing everything alone, especially if you've been hurt before, especially if you once gave someone genuine access to your heart and regretted it afterward. See, men remember emotional humiliation far longer than they admit. One betrayal can change how openly a man loves for years, sometimes decades. That's why emotionally guarded men often appear hard to read, not because they feel less, usually because they feel too much and no longer trust the consequences. And then someone arrives who slowly lowers those defenses without even trying, not through manipulation, not through perfection, but through emotional resonance. That feeling of, I can finally exhale around this person. Do you understand how rare that is psychologically? To feel emotionally safe enough to stop performing, to stop monitoring yourself constantly, to stop trying to appear unaffected. For many men, that's rarer than love itself. And this is where things become emotionally complicated. Because once someone becomes associated with emotional relief, your attachment to them intensifies quickly. Not necessarily because they're your soulmate, but because your nervous system begins associating them with emotional regulation, comfort, relief from loneliness, relief from numbness, relief from the exhausting pressure of pretending you're fine all the time. That's why losing certain people feels physically painful. Your body experiences emotional withdrawal almost like survival panic. Sleep changes, appetite changes, focus disappears. You feel restless for no logical reason, and the mind keeps trying to solve the connection because unresolved emotional experiences are psychologically difficult for humans to accept, especially men who are used to fixing problems through logic. But emotions are not math. Closure is not always clean, and sometimes the hardest truth is this. You met this person because your inner world was ready to change, even if your conscious mind wasn't. Some people arrive as mirrors, not mirrors of your strengths, mirrors of your unmet needs, your emotional patterns, your avoidance, your fear of intimacy, your fear of abandonment, your habit of confusing emotional intensity with emotional security. That last one matters, because intense chemistry can feel profound while still being psychologically unstable. A connection can awaken you and still not be healthy for you long term. And deep down, I think many men already sense the difference, but they resist it because awakening feels meaningful, even painful awakening, especially painful awakening, because at least pain makes you feel something real again. And for someone who's been emotionally disconnected for years, that can become dangerously seductive. There's a moment in almost every intense connection where something subtle shifts. It's not loud, it doesn't announce itself, it's just a change in tone. A delay that used to feel normal suddenly feels loaded. A message that used to feel warm now feels slightly uncertain. And your mind starts doing what it always does when emotional safety becomes unclear. It starts filling in the gaps. But here's what I want you to notice about that process. It rarely starts with truth. It starts with fear. And fear is a creative storyteller. It doesn't wait for evidence. It builds narratives. He's losing interest. I said something wrong. She's pulling away. Maybe I wasn't enough. And slowly, the connection that once felt grounding begins to feel like emotional instability. But the truth is often simpler than the mind wants to accept. People don't always shift because of you. Sometimes they shift because of their own internal world, their stress, their emotional capacity, their fear of intimacy, their past experiences, their confusion. But when you're emotionally invested, neutrality disappears. Everything becomes personal. That's one of the hidden psychological costs of attachment. Your perception stops being objective. And for men who already struggle with expressing emotional uncertainty, this becomes internal chaos. Because you don't want to seem needy, you don't want to misread things, you don't want to confront the possibility that you might be more invested than they are. So you start containing everything. You go quiet. You observe more than you speak. You analyze instead of ask. And slowly, something dangerous happens. You stop experiencing the connection and start studying it. like it's a problem you need to solve rather than a human interaction you're participating in. And I want to be very honest with you here. That shift, when you stop being present and start becoming hyper-aware, is usually where emotional pain begins to deepen. Because presence allows flow, but analysis creates distance. And distance in something you care about feels like loss, even if nothing has actually ended. This is where many men get stuck. They confuse emotional uncertainty with emotional rejection, and those are not the same thing. Uncertainty says, I don't know where this is going. Rejection says, I am unwanted. But the emotional brain often blends them together, especially if you've had experiences in the past where connection did end suddenly, without explanation, without closure, without emotional accountability. Your nervous system remembers that. It doesn't care about logic, it cares about protection. So when something feels similar, even slightly, it begins preparing for loss in advance. That's why you might feel yourself pulling back even when you don't want to. That's why you might act indifferent while internally feeling deeply engaged. That contradiction isn't confusion, it's self-protection trying to avoid future pain. But here's the paradox. The more you try to protect yourself emotionally, the less clearly you can actually see what's happening in front of you. And that can create distance where there doesn't need to be any. Not always, but sometimes. And this is where the deeper truth starts to emerge. Not every emotional intensity is a sign you've met the one. And not every emotional uncertainty is a sign something is ending. Sometimes it's just two imperfect nervous systems trying to understand each other without enough clarity, without enough communication, and without enough emotional language. And that gap between feeling and understanding is where most anxiety lives, but also where most growth begins. Because this is usually the point where a man is forced to confront something he's avoided for a long time. How he handles emotional ambiguity. Does he rush to conclusions? Does he withdraw? Does he overthink in silence? Or does he learn to sit with discomfort without turning it into a story about his worth? That answer matters more than the relationship itself sometimes. Because the real transformation isn't about the person you met, it's about who you become in response to emotional uncertainty. And if you're honest with yourself, that's what this connection has been revealing all along. At some point, you start asking the question in a quieter voice. Not the dramatic version, not the angry version, the honest one that comes when you're alone and there's no one to impress. Why them? Out of everyone? And it sounds like a question about the other person, but it isn't. It's actually a question about timing, about emotional readiness, about what part of you was active when they entered your life. Because people don't just meet each other in a vacuum, they meet each other in states. You were in a state when you met them, even if you didn't notice it. Maybe you were tired in a way you didn't fully acknowledge. Maybe you were emotionally muted, just going through routines. Maybe you were hopeful but cautious, or open but guarded, or lonely but pretending not to be. And then they arrive, and suddenly your internal state becomes visible again. That's one of the most unsettling things about certain connections. They don't just add something to your life, they reveal what was already there. And men often resist that realization because it removes the fantasy of randomness. It's easier to believe, I met them because they're special. It's harder to consider, I met them because something in me was ready to feel again. Not in a mystical sense, in a psychological one. Because attraction is not just about the person in front of you, it's about what your nervous system recognizes as emotionally significant based on your history. That's why sometimes you feel drawn to people who are emotionally inconsistent or unavailable in subtle ways. Not because you want instability, but because your emotional system has learned familiarity in certain patterns. And familiarity can feel like chemistry, even when it isn't safety. That's where things get complicated. Because part of you wants depth, but another part of you is afraid of it. So you get pulled into dynamics that feel intense but not always steady, and you start interpreting intensity as meaning. But intensity is not proof of destiny. It's often proof of emotional activation. And emotional activation can come from many places. Unmet needs, old attachment wounds, novelty, validation, even simple timing. This is why the same person can feel completely different depending on where you are in your life. When you are emotionally open, they feel magnetic. When you are grounded and full, they may feel ordinary. That doesn't make them less important. It makes the experience more human. And I think this is where a lot of confusion begins for men, because we are not often taught to separate emotional intensity from emotional compatibility. We are taught to chase clarity through connection, but connection doesn't always give clarity immediately. Sometimes it gives reflection first. It shows you your patterns before it shows you the relationship. And that can feel like chaos if you're not used to self-reflection through emotion. So instead of asking, "What is this connection showing me about myself?" you ask, "What does this person mean for my life?" But those are very different questions. One externalizes meaning, the other internalizes awareness. And the second one is usually where growth begins. Because eventually you may notice something uncomfortable. You weren't just attracted to them, you were also responding to a version of yourself that existed only in their presence. A version of you that felt more alive, more emotionally available, more open. And the fear underneath all of this is simple. What if I can't access that version of myself without them? That fear is powerful, but it is also misleading. Because they didn't create that version of you, they activated it. And activation is not dependency. It just feels like it at first. And if you sit with that idea for a moment, it changes the entire meaning of the connection. Not into something smaller, but into something more honest. Because now it's no longer just about losing a person. It becomes about understanding what they revealed. There's a point where you either romanticize the connection or you begin to see it clearly. And clarity doesn't always feel comforting at first. It feels quieter, less dramatic, almost disappointing in a strange way. Because part of you may have wanted the story to mean something larger than life, something undeniable, something that proves you were chosen or meant or destined. But real emotional growth rarely arrives as destiny. It arrives as recognition. And recognition can feel surprisingly ordinary. You start noticing things you didn't want to notice before. The inconsistency wasn't just mysterious, it was inconsistent. The emotional highs weren't just passion, they were contrast. The longing wasn't just love, it was uncertainty searching for resolution. And yet, none of that invalidates what you felt. That's important, because men often swing between two extremes. Either this meant everything, or this meant nothing. But psychology doesn't work in absolutes like that. A connection can be real and still not be permanent. It can be meaningful and still not be stable. It can change you deeply and still not be meant to stay. And I think this is the part that quietly reshapes a man if he lets it. The realization that emotional impact is not the same as emotional destiny. Because what you're really trying to understand isn't just them, it's what they awakened in you that you don't want to lose again. The feeling of being emotionally alive, the sense of wanting to be better, more present, more open, the subtle hope that maybe connection doesn't have to feel distant or controlled. But here's the truth that's often difficult to sit with. If someone awakened those parts of you, they didn't own them. They revealed them. And anything that can be revealed can also be developed within you, with or without them. That doesn't erase the emotional significance of what you shared. It just places it back where it belongs, inside your growth, not inside your dependency. And maybe the most honest question you can ask yourself now is not, "Why did I meet this person?" but rather, "What did I become emotionally aware of because I met them?" Because that question doesn't trap you in the past. It returns power to the present. And if you're listening closely to yourself in this moment, you might notice something subtle happening. Less obsession, less confusion, more understanding. Not because everything is resolved, but because you stop turning the experience into something you had to decode endlessly in order to feel okay. And that shift matters more than most men realize. Because emotional maturity isn't the absence of attachment. It's the ability to hold attachment without losing yourself inside it. And sometimes, a connection enters your life not to complete a story, but to interrupt an old emotional pattern you didn't realize you were still living inside. Not to define you, but to wake you up to yourself. And once that happens, the real question changes again. Not why them, Not even what now, but something quieter, something more grounded. How do I carry what I learned from this, without needing to return to the pain to remember it? And that's where your story doesn't end. It just stops repeating itself in the same way.